It's prudent for us now to start thinking about moving people.
But Monday was too late. We've had people die. Could anybody answer why?
I don't think, what we're getting into is folks that don't know this area and got Monday morning quarterbacking, and we're not going to get into that right now because we did the best they have, and we're sorry for that, but we're not going to get into Monday morning quarterbacking right now.
Nearly 10 years after the 2016 Gatlinburg Wildfires, one of the deadliest and most destructive fires in Tennessee history, the legal fight over what happened has come to an end, at least perceivably. On March 31st, a federal judge dismissed the final remaining claims against the United States government. That ruling didn't determine who was right or wrong, or whether the decisions made during the fire were justified. It answered a different question, whether those decisions can be held legally accountable at all. And the answer was no. For those lost and those who lost.
This is the largest fire in the last 100 years of the state of Tennessee.
Do I think that the national park at that point in time had any idea where it was going to go or how big it was going to be? No. I don't think anybody could have predicted what we then saw early morning hours of November 29th, based on afternoon hours of November 28th.
It is a popular trail in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. According to investigators, they were playing with matches.
5:20 p.m. Someone reports a fire covering about an acre and a half.
By Thanksgiving Day, the size of the fire doubled. The firefight continued over the weekend.
And by Saturday, November 26th, the fire grew to 8 acres. 35 acres by Sunday, the 27th.
Then at 10 o'clock in the morning, November 28th, fire grew exponentially to 500 acres. 11:35 a.m., a spot fire breaks out near the Twin Creeks Picnic Pavilion, less than 2 miles from the city.
1 p.m., gusts are now up to 50 miles an hour.
I don't think anybody could have predicted what we then saw early morning hours of November 29th.
Historically dry conditions and the fire already burning, the wind was introduced.
So it wasn't a drop in the ball. The day before the wind advisory came in, we actually had 4 helicopters doing block.
So the question here isn't what happened. We all know what happened. The question is what was known before the fire reached Gatlinburg, what decisions were made as it unfolded, and how all of that led to a result where, despite documented failures, no one was held accountable. The Chimney Tops 2 fire started November 23, 2016, inside the Great Smoky Mountains National Park along the Chimney Tops Trail. Investigators later determined it was started by 2 juveniles playing with matches. At first, it didn't look like much. The fire was small, about an acre and a half, burning in steep terrain away from homes and businesses. But it didn't go out. It kept burning, day after day. By November 26, it had grown to around 8 acres. By November 27th, 35 acres. Not massive, but clearly not under control. During that time, the fire wasn't aggressively attacked. It was monitored, watched, allowed to burn under the assumption that it would remain manageable.
Gatlinburg Police Department. They can work for any dispatch. How are you? All right, how are you? Hey, you better pass on to your third shift. We do have an active wildfire in the Chimney Tops area. They're aware of it, and they're going to be coming in the morning to do more aggressive attack on it. But they are going to let it burn some tonight. At Chimney Tops. At Chimney Tops. Okay. All right. All right. Appreciate it. Thank you. Bye.
That assumption is where this starts to matter. Because while the fire was growing, conditions across the mountains were getting worse. East Tennessee was in the middle of a drought. Vegetation across the Smokies was dry and highly combustible, and forecasts were already showing strong winds moving into the area. Those aren't minor details. Those are the exact conditions that turn a slow-burning fire into a fast-moving one. So this wasn't a situation where the risk was unknown. The fire was active, the environment was deteriorating, the ingredients for escalation were already there. While everything was changing, the response did not. By the morning of November 28th, the fire was still burning inside the park, but this is where everything shifts. Around 10 a.m., the fire jumped from a few dozen acres to roughly 500. That's not gradual growth. That's a fire breaking loose. And it didn't happen without warning. The wind event had moved into the mountains, with gusts reaching 50 miles per hour. The region was already dry from weeks of drought. Low humidity, high winds, dry fuel. This is exactly how fires spread quickly and unpredictably. And those conditions weren't a surprise. Park Service officials were aware of the drought. They were aware of fire behavior. They were aware that a significant wind event was forecast to move into the area. So the situation didn't suddenly become dangerous out of nowhere. It was becoming dangerous in real time, with known factors driving it. According to reporting from the Knox News, a National Park Service official warned earlier that day that the fire had potential to leave the park and reach populated areas. That means the risk to Gatlinburg wasn't realized after the fact. It was identified while the fire was still inside the park. At the same time, internal communication shows the same awareness. In a message included in reporting, Greg Solinsky texted, "Monday might get exciting." That line reflects awareness that conditions were shifting. But what it doesn't reflect is urgency. And that's the issue. Because by midday on November 28th, this was no longer a manageable fire. It was no longer contained. It was becoming an active threat to the city. And the officials knew that. The conditions had changed, the risk had changed, the potential outcome had changed, and the response did not keep pace with that reality. By the afternoon of November 28th, the fire wasn't just growing, it was moving towards Gatlinburg. And inside the Park Service, that reality was already being discussed. According to reporting from Knox News, park officials were communicating over the radio that the fire could leave the park and reach as far as Ski Mountain. That detail matters because Ski Mountain isn't just a point on a map. It's one of the most densely populated residential areas in Gatlinburg. It's where people live, it's where people were that night, and it's where many fatalities would later occur. So this wasn't a vague warning. This was a specific concern about a specific place. But that level of detail never made it to the city officials. In other words, the Park Service officials never let the city know at the time that they knew. According to reporting, it would be hours before park officials formally notified Gatlinburg authorities that the fire could leave the park, and when they did, they never specified Ski Mountain, so they knew where it was heading, but didn't let city officials know. City officials were left with a general understanding of the threat, not a location, not the path, not the urgency tied to that specific area, and that gap matters. Because when you don't know where a fire is going, you can't prioritize evacuations, you can't position resources, and you can't warn the people who are at most at risk. That disconnect between what was being discussed inside the park and what was communicated outside of it left critical decisions being made without critical information. By the time the full danger was understood, the fire had already moved. And for many people on Ski Mountain, it was already too late. As the fire grew on November 28th and began pushing towards Gatlinburg, one of the most critical periods of the entire event was overnight. Because fires do not stop when the sun goes down. They continue to move, they continue to grow, and under the right conditions they accelerate fast. And yet, according to reporting and later reviews, the fire was not actively monitored overnight during multiple periods while it was burning inside the park. That matters, because continuous observation is how changes get caught early. It's how you know whether a fire is holding, spreading, or beginning to break loose. Without that, you are no longer reacting to what's happening. You're reacting to what you think is happening. That brings us to one of the most revealing moments in the entire timeline. An audio recording obtained by reporters captured Park Superintendent Cassius Cash receiving a call around 3 a.m. On that call, a police dispatcher told him the fire had grown. According to reporting from Tyler Whetstone, Cash responded by downplaying the report instead of treating it as something that needed to be checked immediately. Whetstone described it as a weird call because Cash assumed the fire had not grown, did not verify information, and did not escalate the response. According to that reporting, he treated it as not a big deal and a small thing. By the time the fire began pushing into Gatlinburg on the evening of November 28th, the situation had already crossed a critical threshold. The fire was no longer a possibility. It was already there. And for many people in the city, that realization did not come through as a warning. It came through what they could see: smoke filling the sky, ash falling, flames visible on the mountainside. Because the systems meant to alert the public were not working the way they needed to, emergency communication efforts were made throughout the day, but they were not consistent. Text alerts did not reach anyone. Radio communication was limited, and sirens meant to warn people were not activated until later that evening. By the time those sirens sounded, the fire had already gained ground.
If the siren system's working, it probably would not be a bad thing to try to do a manual evacuation using that. All possible, if we could use the flood warning sirens to assist in evacuation as part of downtown Gatlinburg, it probably would not be a bad idea. And we set off the sirens to see if we can't get some of these. I've still got a lot of occupants out of video and stuff. We need to be getting them evacuated.
At 8:30 on the 28th, the emergency sirens finally sounded, but as emergency communication systems suffered that day, there were no responses to the previous requests. According to reports, communication attempts were made to notify the public about evacuation throughout the day. Despite these attempts, the public remained largely unaware of the imminent danger the fire posed. Moving at an estimated half-mile per hour, the fire consumed mountainsides and quickly reached Gatlinburg city limits. Text alerts and radio communications were failing, so they made a last-ditch effort through the National Weather Service to reach the public, but that was at 9:03 p.m. Sadly, this was too late for some. And even then, the warning was not clear. There was not a single coordinated message telling people exactly what was happening and exactly where they needed to go. Instead, evacuation became something people figured out in real time. Law enforcement and firefighters went door to door in some areas trying to get people out. Others left because they could physically see the fire approaching. And some did not leave at all, because they did not realize how serious the situation had become until it was too late. As a matter of fact, there were accounts of people still out in Gatlinburg, eating at restaurants, walking the strip, just hours before a full evacuation was underway. That's how late this warning reached them, because by the time the message was clear, the fire was already in the city. By the time the sun came up on November 29th, the full scale of what had happened was becoming clear. The fire had moved out of the park, down the mountains, and into Gatlinburg. What started as a small fire along the Chimney Tops trail had turned into a fast-moving wildfire that reached homes, neighborhoods, and businesses across the city. Entire hillsides were burning. Structures were fully engulfed. Roads were blocked by fire, debris, and traffic as people tried to escape. And in many cases, there was no clear path out. And again, by the time this was over, 14 people had lost their lives. 191 others were injured. More than 2,400 structures were destroyed. Homes, cabins, and businesses gone. Entire neighborhoods that had been part of Gatlinburg for decades were reduced to ash in a matter of hours. The fire burned approximately 17,000 acres and caused more than $1 billion in damage. But the numbers don't fully capture what happened, because behind every one of them is a moment where someone didn't know what was coming. People were caught in their homes, on the roads, and in areas where the fire moved faster than they could. In the immediate aftermath of the fire, attention turned to what caused it and who could be held responsible. Investigators quickly identified 2 juveniles as the source of the fire. They had been on the Chimney Tops trail and were accused of starting the fire with matches. Both were charged with aggravated arson.
We do know they're not from Sevier County. They were taken into custody early this morning and charged with aggravated arson, and there may be additional charges coming. Authorities say, quote, everything is on the table.
I can tell you that this investigation is active and ongoing. Our promise is that we will do every effort to help bring closure to those who have lost so much.
At that point, it seemed like there would be a clear path forward. A cause had been identified, charges had been filed, and for many, it looked like the legal process would move toward accountability. But that never happened. Those charges were eventually dropped. The defense argued that while the juveniles may have started the fire, the scale of the disaster that followed could not directly be tied to their actions. They pointed at the extreme drought conditions, the high winds, and the rapid spread of the fire as intervening factors. Conditions that made it impossible to prove that the juveniles were responsible for the deaths and destruction in Gatlinburg.
Today, charges were dropped in their entirety.
This afternoon, though, an unimaginable turn of events. State prosecutors announced they would be dropping all charges against the boys. Their lawyer addressed reporters.
There is no evidence that the conduct of the juveniles caused the death and devastation in Gatlinburg.
And then there's this, a memoranda of agreement stating prosecution of crimes within the national park lies outside the jurisdiction of state officials. Because the park is technically federal property, state prosecutors have no jurisdiction there to press charges.
State prosecutors face limitations on how they could pursue charges for something that originated within a federal boundary, which meant the case would have to be handled at the federal level. And as the story continues, that detail becomes more and more important because it effectively puts the responsibility for both the management of the fire and the legal accountability tied to it into the hands of the same system that was responsible for managing it in the first place. With those factors combined, the criminal case ended without a conviction. And that outcome shifted the focus, because if the people who started the fire weren't going to be held responsible for what happened, then attention turned to the people responsible for managing it. Beginning in 2016, lawsuits were filed against the federal government. First came individual claims from victims, then a class action lawsuit involving hundreds of survivors, then claims from more than 40 insurance companies totaling hundreds of millions of dollars. Then attention turned to the people responsible for managing it. Beginning in 2018, the legal fight shifted from criminal charges to civil claims against the federal government. The first major case came in May of that year, when two survivors filed a $14.8 million federal lawsuit. This wasn't just about property damage. It was about loss of life, injuries, and the argument that the fire had not been handled properly while it was still inside the park. The claim centered on the idea that the National Park Service officials failed to act on changing conditions and failed to warn people in time for them to get out safely. That case didn't stay small for long, though. By August of 2018, it expanded into a class action lawsuit, bringing together hundreds of victims. These were homeowners, business owners, families, people who had lost everything. Entire communities that had been part of Gatlinburg for decades were now part of a legal effort to hold the federal government accountable. Then in November of 2019, a third layer of legal pressure was added. More than 40 insurance companies filed claims totaling over $450 million against the federal government. These weren't emotional claims. They were financial ones, backed by damage assessments, internal reports, and the cost of what had been lost. And even those claims pointed to the same conclusion, that the handling of the Chimney Tops 2 fire, particularly in the hours and days before it reached Gatlinburg, played a direct role in how much damage it ultimately caused. Across all these lawsuits, individual, class action, and corporate, the core argument never changed. That what happened in Gatlinburg wasn't just a result of wind, drought, and terrain. It was a result of how the fire was handled, and that the people responsible for managing it failed to act in time to prevent the scale of destruction that followed. As the lawsuits moved forward, attention turned to what the government's own investigation had found. The U.S. Department of the Interior conducted a formal review of how Chimney Tops 2 was handled. This wasn't an outside criticism. This was an internal report, based on interviews, documentation, and a detailed review of decisions made before and during the fire. And what this report found is important. It did not describe a well-executed response. It described what was called weaknesses in preparedness and planning. It pointed to excessively informal strategy development, and it identified a problematic lack of oversight. Most critically, it documented failures in communication, specifically noting that the park lacked the necessary means to warn external officials about the coming danger of the fire. This language is not vague. Those are direct findings: weaknesses, informal strategy, lack of oversight, an inability to warn. And those findings line up directly with what we've already seen: a fire growing under worsening conditions, information being discussed internally but not clearly communicated outward, and warnings that did not reach people in time. The report even goes further, stating that unless the Park Service is willing to fundamentally change how it approaches wildland fire, history will be repeated. So this report identifies the problems, it names them, it documents them, but then it reaches its conclusion. Because despite all that, the Department of the Interior ultimately stated that there was no evidence of negligence by the National Park Service personnel. Unbelievable. But no one should be surprised, because when an agency is allowed to investigate itself, no one should be surprised when they say that they're not liable. So on one hand, you have a report that describes weaknesses, lack of oversight, failures of communication, and on the other hand, you have a conclusion that says no one is negligent. These two things exist at the same time. And that contradiction becomes central to everything that happens next. As the lawsuits moved through the courts, the central question wasn't just what happened during the fire, it was whether anyone could be held legally responsible under the Federal Tort Claims Act, the law that governs most lawsuits against the federal government. Oh, not to mention, this same entity also writes the laws by which you could sue them. And before the courts ever had to confront that question, a large portion of the case was already thrown out on a technicality. In 2020, a federal judge dismissed many of the claims because they didn't meet the administrative filing requirements under that law. Before victims can even sue, they had to submit a formal claim, an SF-95, with a specific dollar amount attached. In this case, the court ruled that many of these filings didn't meet that standard. So the claims were dismissed, not because of what happened during the fire, not because of the decisions that were made, but because of how the paperwork was filled out. A technicality.
A federal judge in Greenville said the victims failed to properly state all of their claims on a government form. But during the hearing back in January, Ben Glassman, an attorney representing the victims, argued the victims should not be punished for not using specific words.
And that was just the first barrier. And that matters, because it meant for many victims, the case never even reached the question of responsibility. It ended on that technicality. But even the claims that survived that first cut ran into something else. As the case continued, the courts did look at the actions of the National Park Service, and at one point, a federal court acknowledged that the Park Service fell short of its mandatory duty to warn people in and around Gatlinburg. And that's not subtle language, that's a recognition that the warning failed. But even that didn't lead to accountability, because under the same law, there's another layer of protection, a discretionary function exemption. It shields government decisions that involve judgment or choice, even when those decisions have real consequence, or they're wrong. And in this case, the courts determined that the decisions about how to manage the fire, how to communicate risk, and how and when to warn the public all fell into that protected category. Which means those decisions, no matter how flawed, no matter how delayed, no matter how devastating the outcome, could not be used to hold the government legally responsible. So the court didn't say nothing went wrong. It said that what went wrong doesn't count. Because by the time the final ruling on March 31st, the case had already been cut down once by technical filing requirements, and what remained was ultimately protected by law. It came down to technicalities, and a system that protected and continues to protect itself.
Now this, the lawsuits filed against the Great Smoky Mountains National Park over the federal response to the 2016 Gatlinburg wildfires have been dismissed. After years of federal court hearings, the court determined the National Park Service's decisions about fire warnings involved protected discretion, and because of that, the federal government cannot be sued for damages. The dismissal covers all of the suits filed against the National Park Service. 14 people died in the wildfires that began in late 2016, one of the worst natural disasters in state history, and over 2,400 buildings were destroyed and more than 17,000 acres were burned.
Now, with all that being said, and before we close, I'll say this plainly just as I did at the beginning of the video. The conclusions in this video are my interpretation of the facts as I see them. But to me, those facts are not complicated. The fire was burning, conditions were getting worse, officials knew about the drought, they knew about the wind, they discussed the fire reaching the city, and it still wasn't handled like it was about to reach people. The fire grew, the risk changed, the situation escalated, but the response didn't. There were chances to catch it, chances to communicate it, chances to get ahead of it. Those chances passed. Afterward, the failures weren't hidden. They were written down. They were documented. They were communicated. Weaknesses in preparedness, informal strategy, lack of oversight, failure to warn. A court even said the Park Service fell short of its duty to warn, and still, no one was held legally responsible. Because first, claims were thrown out over paperwork, then what remained was protected under the law. And that's how it ends. People died, families lost everything, entire communities were changed overnight. No one ever had to answer for the 14 people who lost their lives. No one had to answer for the families who lost everything. And to those families, our thoughts are with you. What happened here should never be forgotten. That's why this video exists. Because this isn't just about what happened. It's about making sure it's remembered. Call it what you want, but the facts are laid out, the failures are documented, and the outcome was still no accountability. It doesn't feel like justice. It feels like a system that closes ranks. That just about does it for us. Thanks as always, and we'll see you next time.
Gatlinburg Police Department.
Yes, this is. We're trying to get out. We're on Kimberly, getting down to Greystone Heights. Can we get out?
To my knowledge, yes. None of that area is in the mandatory evacuation area.
Well, you need to evacuate because the fire is at the bottom of our house.
The fire department's in control of the evacuations. Thank you.